Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. Today we're reviewing the high points of our biology curriculum so that when you get to that state test at the end of the year, you'll be all refreshed and know what's going on. So let's go ahead and get the ball rolling and see what we're talking about today. So these are our standards. What we're mostly addressing is Gregor Mendel and his 3 laws. We'll also look at some non-Mendelian inheritance as well as pedigrees towards the end of the lesson. So let's go ahead and get started. So Gregor Mendel had 3 laws of heredity. These are those 3 laws. The first one there is the law of dominance. What's going on here is that you probably remember that for each trait there are different alleles. Some of them are dominant and some of them are recessive. The ones that are dominant are stronger in a sense that they overshadow the recessive traits. And the only way you'll see the recessive trait is that if you have 2 genes, both alleles of the recessive type. That's the only way you'll be able to see that recessive trait. Okay? The next law here is the law of segregation. What's going on here is that remember, each person has 2 alleles for a trait, but when you pass those on to the next offspring, you can only pass on one of them. So each person gets 1 allele from their mom and 1 allele from their dad, and then that's the 2 alleles that each person has. Okay, the next one is the law of independent assortment. The type of inheritance that Gregor Mendel was studying, what's going on here is that these traits are not connected. So he was looking at these pea plants. What he found is that just because a pea plant was tall doesn't necessarily mean that they always had the same color flowers or pea pods. So these traits are not connected, okay? So those are his 3 laws, and these are all going to be important as we're looking at Punnett squares and pedigrees as we continue the lesson today. Okay? So the first one I wanted to talk about, this is a type of non-Mendelian inheritance. It's called incomplete dominance. The word I want you to remember for this is a mix, because what's going on here is that the heterozygous genotype tends to be intermediate between the homozygous types. So let's look at what's going on here. So these snapdragon flowers come in many colors, okay? And the reason for that is if you were to cross a red snapdragon flower with a white snapdragon flower, you would get pink flowers. So you can see how we're mixing the colors here, right? The big R is homozygous dominant, and that one is red. The white is homozygous recessive, and that's little r. But when you mix them together, the heterozygous one there, the big R, little r, that's going to be pink. And so you can see how we're mixing the traits there. Okay? Genes show incomplete dominance when the heterozygous phenotype is intermediate. So the heterozygous phenotype is intermediate between the 2 homozygous types, okay? The key word here is to mix. We're mixing the colors up, right? And the way I always remember it is that the word mix has an I in it and incomplete has an I in it. So that's just a little way to remember that information. Okay, one that people tend to confuse this one next is our next one, and this is called codominance. What's happening in codominance, the word I really want you to remember here is both. Okay, in codominance, in this case, the heterozygous individual displays both phenotypes of 2 different homozygous parents. So our example here is that if you were to cross a black chicken with a white chicken, that offspring would be both black and white. And so we're seeing both phenotypes here. We're not mixing them together. These chickens aren't gray, they're black and white, okay? And so again, remember that word both, okay? Both has an O in it, and codominance has an O in it. So that's a little way to remember that so you don't get them confused, okay? Let's keep it going. Okay, the next thing I wanted to look at is pedigrees. Okay, you're going to need to know what all these different shapes mean, so I wanted to review those with you real quick. So generally, squares are going to be representing males, circles are going to be representing females. Okay, horizontal lines, so lines in between shapes, show mating, okay, and then vertical lines show kinship, so who's related to who. Okay, there's some other information that we can glean from this pedigree. So one thing is that if a shape is shaded in, that means that that individual has the trait that we're tracking, okay? Whatever trait it is, that person has it, okay? Something else you need to know is how to identify what type of inheritance pattern it is. There's usually 3 types. It can either be X-linked, recessive, or dominant. In X-linked traits, what you really want to know is that those X-linked or sex-linked trait mostly affect males. And you can see in this pedigree that the trait we're tracking is mostly affecting males because only the squares are shaded in. And so a good guess for this one would be that this is an X-linked trait. because it's only affecting males. Okay, how you can identify dominant versus recessive is basically how often it's showing up. So if a trait appears in every generation, that means it's probably dominant, and if it skips a generation, that means it's probably recessive. So I think this is most likely sex-linked because it's only affecting the males, but my next guess would be that it was recessive, and that's because you can see it's not affecting the top generation, but it is affecting the next two generations. So if it skips a generation, it's recessive. If it shows up in every generation, it's dominant. Okay, great. So let's keep that going. I basically just have some review questions for y'all, and I wanted to go over these so you know how to think about them. So let's read this one, and then we'll review it on the board together. So this says some flowers are controlled by codominance. Red flowers, blue flowers, and speckled flowers. And it's asking us to cross a red flower with a speckled flower. What is the phenotypic ratio? So first of all, what I want you to notice is that this inheritance type is codominance. And codominance, that means that the heterozygous, we're going to see both of them. And you can see that this is true because the two traits here are red and blue, but the heterozygous is going to be speckled, which means it has red and blue flowers in it. So let's do this cross and see what we can come up with. So it says cross a red flower, so this is our red flower, and a speckled flower. So that's going to be like this. Let me set my Punnett square up real quickly, and then we're just going to fill this in. Okay? And it wants to know what is the phenotypic ratio. Okay, so we want to figure out what these flowers are going to look like. These two are both going to be red. Okay, so we have two red here. Okay, two red. And then these two are going to be that speckled flower color. So two red to two speckled is going to be our phenotypic ratio for this one. Okay, and again, remember that codominance, the intermediate, shows both traits. Okay, let's go to the next one and see what we're looking at. Okay, this says the hair form gene shows incomplete dominance. Straight hair is capital S, that one is dominant. Curly hair is lowercase s, that one is recessive. And the wavy hair, which is capital S, lowercase s, is heterozygous. Mr. and Mrs. Calhoun both have wavy hair. What percentage of their children will also have wavy hair? So let's go ahead and set this up. This is both parents are like this. When I get letters that look pretty similar in the capital and lowercase form, I really tend to over-exaggerate the size there, so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. Let's go ahead and fill this in. Okay, and it wants to know what percentage of their children will have wavy hair. The wavy hair is the heterozygous one. You can see that we have two that are going to have wavy hair, so what percentage? We would say 50%. Okay, this one would be the straight hair, and this one would be the curly hair. Okay, so that's kind of how you can think about those. Okay, I've got one more to do with y'all. This is a pedigree. What we're going to do is walk through here. We're going to figure out what the inheritance type is and then try to figure out the genotype of these different individuals. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So we already know what these shapes and the different lines mean. When you get a pedigree, there's really three questions you want to ask yourself, okay? So you want to ask yourself, who has the trait that we are tracking? What type of inheritance pattern is it? And then we need to be able to figure out the genotype of everyone in the pedigree. So let's go ahead and take a look at this and get started. Number one says, how many individuals have the trait that we are tracking? Now remember, the shaded shapes are the individuals that have the trait that we are tracking. We don't know what trait it is, but the people that are shaded in have it. So let's just count the shaded shapes here. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shapes that are filled in, and that means 5 individuals have this trait, okay? Let's go to the next one here. It says, is the trait that we are tracking dominant or recessive? Okay, when you get a question like this, you really want to ask yourself, does this trait appear in every generation, or does it skip a generation? If it appears in every generation, it's going to be dominant, and if it skips a generation, it's going to be recessive. Here you can see that the trait is showing up in every line, so it's showing up in every generation, and that means that this trait is most likely dominant, okay? So let's write that in. All right, the last thing, before we get to number 3, I wanted to review something with you really quickly. I wanted to talk about our different allele combinations. Okay, remember that there are 3 different allele combinations individuals can have. Okay, we can be homozygous dominant, which would look something like this. We can be homozygous recessive, which would look something like this. Or you can be heterozygous, which means you have one of each. Okay, this is going to be very important as we start filling in these genotypes of these individuals. So I want you to ask yourself, out of these 3 allele combinations, which one would we use for the unshaded shapes? Remember, the shapes here that are not shaded do not have the trait, and this trait is dominant. So there's only one of these 3 combinations that would make these individuals not show the trait, and that's this one, homozygous recessive. Because if you even have one capital letter, you would be showing this dominant trait, right? So we know what the genotype of all the unshaded shapes are. I'm going to go ahead and write that in first. It's going to make filling out the rest of the genotypes a little bit easier. So remember, all of these shapes, they're not shaded, so they don't have the trait. This trait is dominant, and so there's only one combination of alleles that would make them not show the trait, and that's if they didn't have any dominant alleles. Okay, so we know what all those are, and a couple of these are in question 3. So let's go ahead and look at this. So we already know what B is, we already know what D is, and we know what E and F are, because all of these are unshaded shapes. So we can see here at B, it's talking about the second person in the first generation. So that's talking about this individual. So we know what the genotype is here. D is asking for the 4th person in the second generation. That's talking about this individual. Same thing, not shaded, so we know what their genotype is. And then same thing for E and F. We know what their genotypes are already. Okay, so that means that we only have a couple more that we need to fill in. A is asking about the first person in the first generation, so this individual. Okay, now we know that this woman, it's a circle, so this is a woman. We know the mother here has to have at least one capital letter, right? Because they are showing this dominant trait. So that means that they have to have at least one dominant allele. We don't know what the other one is right now, but we can figure it out. I need you to remember Mendel's law of segregation, okay? What this says is that a parent can only pass on one of their alleles. We can see here pretty easily that this the daughter here, does not show the trait. So that means that dad gave one of the alleles. Because of the law of segregation, we know that the dad can't pass on both of those recessive alleles. She has to get one from her mom. And because we already know what her genotype is, that helps us figure out what that unknown allele is. She has to be heterozygous. And this would be true. So we'll write it in like that. This is making this pedigree true because she does have the trait, because she has a dominant allele, but she's also heterozygous. That's the only way that she could have an offspring that did not show the trait. All right, let's look at this last one real quick. So this is talking about the second person in the second generation. So it's asking about this person right here. Same thing as number 1, or letter A there. We know what one of his alleles has to be a dominant allele because he has the trait, and this is a dominant trait that we're tracking. So he has to have at least one dominant letter. But because he has offspring that do not have the trait, that means his combination has to be heterozygous, just like his mom. Because the mother here is passing on one of her recessive alleles, but she can't pass on both of them. And that means that dad has to provide that other recessive allele. So the allele for this one is going to be capital and then the lowercase d, just like that. Okay? So y'all, thank you so much for following along with me today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.